Well, good afternoon if you are on the Upper West Side of Manhattan or points south or north or a little bit west. Good evening if you are in North London. Special good evening and overnight to our loved ones in Ukraine. We love you. We think of you. We send you music and we wish you peace. And of course, greetings to people all over the world. Today's subject, not today's guest, about whom I will talk in a moment, is going to be some of the great pop singers of recent times, most notably George Michael. My guest is also my friend, James Gavin, but I should say first, welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. And there is my guest, James Gavin. We're friends, so I call him Jim Gavin, who is a wonderful nonpareil music writer. I'm going to call you that for now, because you don't write music, but you write about music, and that's a special art and a special craft. And I'm going to invoke the injunction that I lived with in my house growing up with my father, the musician, who said, Duke Ellington said there are only two types of music, good music and the other kind. So today we will cover opera, we will cover classical music, we will cover what might be called popular music. I don't make these barriers and distinctions. Jim, do you?
I have never made those distinctions in my head because for me, the standard that I've always held to personally is it either moves me or it doesn't move me.
Mm-hmm.
And if a singer, despite that singer's dazzling technique, makes me feel nothing, then I tend to not be interested for very long.
So let's go right to it. There's so many ways of entry that we could have gone to, but let me say first about Jim Gavin that he's the author of wonderful books. His first book was Intimate Nights, The Golden Age of New York Cabaret, and we'll talk about what is Cabaret. It's not a Liza Minnelli movie. Deep in a Dream, The Long Night of Chet Baker, which I confess I've not read, but I've read the others. There is Stormy Weather, The Life of Lena Horne. And years ago, I was out in San Diego and I was visiting someone, and on his bookshelf was Stormy Weather, The Life of Lena Horne. And I said to this fellow, tell me why you have that book. And he said, well, I had read a previous book by this author and I went out and got it just because of that. And I said, well, the author is a good friend of mine. And he said, whatever books James Gavin writes, I will get. So I'm sure his bookshelf is fuller now. You then wrote, Is That All There Is? The Strange Life of Peggy Lee. And your current book, which is receiving phenomenal reviews and coverage in Time, the New York Times got a rave review, Los Angeles Times, USA Today, just everywhere. George Michael, A Life, about one of my favorite singers, George Michael. And I knew that you were working on this for quite a long time. I didn't tell anyone because writers keep other writers' friends secret. But I'm going to just say right away that it's a fantastic book. It chronicles in a very clear-eyed but empathetic way the struggles and terrible sadness that George Michael had. And readers can read it for that. I want to talk to Jim today about George Michael, the musician, but also about Lena Horne, the musician, and Peggy Lee and Chet Baker. And it occurred to me about these four subjects, Jim: Chet Baker, Peggy Lee, Lena Horne, and George Michael. They were all very beautiful people. Did that enter your selection of them, or did it just happen that they were all very beautiful people who had troubled lives and were fantastic musicians?
There is a certain romance in seeing beautiful but tortured souls struggling their way through life, because we envy the beautiful, don't we? And we wish that we were like them, not knowing the price tag that can be attached to that gift from nature. I've never been asked that question before, Fred. And I suppose subconsciously the fact that they were all beautiful became part of the stew of ironies that attracted me to all of these artists. Gosh, where to begin? Let's start with George. The same, I guess, could be true of Lena Horne. People looked upon Lena Horne as gifted and privileged beyond imagination. And it was always hard for people to accept the fact that Lena Horne had tremendous struggles and pains that were somehow tied in with that God-given beauty. One of the things that drew me closer to Lena Horne occurred when I interviewed her for the New York Times. In 1994, Lena Horne was on the verge of making what would be her final comeback. She would at that point have been 76, 77 years old. I forget the month. But in any case, I met Lena Horne in the lobby of a Midtown hotel where she sometimes rented out a room in order to do press. And she had a new album coming out from Blue Note Records, her first in years. And she was about to do a couple of concerts at Carnegie Hall and a few very limited appearances and so forth. And while I had met Lena Horne backstage at the Nederlander Theater in 1981 when I was a teenager, and I saw early in the run her electrifying one-woman show, much imitated, called Lena Horne, the Lady in Her Music. I had had a moment with her in the dressing room back then. She would see, Fred, it's astounding, but after giving a 2-hour concert a day and sometimes 2 per day, Lena Horne would then, after every performance, as far as I know, see anyone who wanted to see her lined up outside her dressing room. And I was one of those people, not imagining that one day I would, in essence, be living with Lena Horne for several years as I wrote that book. But I got an assignment. I pitched the New York Times on a piece about Lena, and they let me do it. And I met her. I was told to meet her in the lobby of this hotel. She arrived with her manager, Sherman Sneed, and Lena was done down. She had on she was a vision in white from head to toe. She had big dark glasses on and a white cap and a baggy white suit. And all of this was, I suppose, intended as camouflage. And yet, as soon as she smiled, that smile, the whiteness of her teeth and the ferocity of her smile was blinding to me. And there I was face to face with her, and I involuntarily pulled back. And that moment gave me an immediate insight into what it must have been like, what it was like to be Lena Horne. Because since she was a girl, her dazzling beauty had intimidated people. It had put people off. It had given people all kinds of preconceptions about her. And I held that realization close. I did my piece. It ran in, again, 1994. And about a decade passed, a decade, in fact, before I undertook to write a whole book about her. But I am so deeply attracted to human struggle, torture, and to the gift that certain artists have to translate those feelings into music. All the people that I've written books about, that portal between their life experience, their personal baggage, and their music making is wide open. Lena could, and Peggy Lee as well, Chet as well, and I would say George too. They could not help but bring their personal baggage with them on stage, and I love that.
Therefore, and let's be mindful that a lot of our audience, though they're music lovers of all kinds, have as their reference opera and classical music. There are 2 singers more than any other who I think audiences equate with pain and great artistry, and those are Maria Callas and Billie Holiday. And people I know who like the music and singing and performing and the aura of Maria Callas tend to like Billie Holiday and vice versa, because they say you can hear the pain in their voice, to which I try to politely respond that sometimes, in the case of Maria Callas, she was a brilliant musician. She was an insightful artist of every kind, but she had some vocal limitations. And maybe sometimes she was opting for a sound that was not conventionally beautiful, as Tosca, as Lady Macbeth in Verdi's Macbeth. And we're not hearing her pain, we're hearing her artistic choices. Billie Holiday struggled with drugs and all kinds of things and died at the age of 44. And you can hear the emotional pain in her voice, but I think maybe she had a lot more artistic control than we give her credit for. And we just, not you and I, but people tend to say, well, can hear her collapsing and falling apart, and that's part of the interest. Whereas someone like a Renata Tebaldi or an Ella Fitzgerald had that rock hard security that made them thrilling and gorgeous and glorious to a different kind of listener who's looking for a different thing. And therefore, my question would be, and you can reply to all of this, do we look for what we want to find in a musician and a performer, or do we find what may be actually there?
I am tempted to say the former. That's another great question, Fred, because I've sometimes thought that whenever we look at a piece of art, whenever we hear someone sing, whenever we watch someone dance, our response to that, to what we see, is intricately interwoven with our entire psychology, our experiences, and what that artist is doing either touches us based on that or it doesn't. And so there is a lot of great art and certainly a lot of great singing that I recognize the greatness of, but it just doesn't do anything for me. It's no shortcoming of the art or of my ears necessarily. It's just that alchemy that takes place when we sit at the opera and watch, for example, an archaic story that may be creaky and cliche ridden in our current perception, but something about it speaks to something that we once felt or suffered or laughed at, and suddenly we're captivated by the experience.
If I knew nothing about George Michael's private life and suffering and background and so on, and simply heard his music, as happened with me, that I just happened to hear a voice on the radio and thought, number one, what a gorgeous voice. Number two, what a magnificent musician. Number three, what a magnificent interpreter. There are videos of George Michael singing a cappella. He was among pop stars, among the most remarkably musical pop stars of all. And I don't think he gets among the general public the kind of credit and acknowledgement for that. Maybe because they just don't know. But what I was always astonished with George Michael is that he was note perfect. He used what we call an opera rubato. He used inflections and cadences that underscored the meaning of the words, the sound of the words. He never, in my view, exaggerated consonants the way certain leader singers do. It was softer in a way, allowing the voice to express the emotion. And another of the many things I always loved about him, yes, he wrote his own music, and I loved his music as music, in addition to words, but just pure music. But he often, in my view, did better versions of other people's songs. And in that way, he was like Ella Fitzgerald, in that he could take a song that was really wonderful when someone else did it, but whether it was Freddie Mercury or Stevie Wonder or Joan Blondell in Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, or anyone, somehow he added a lot more to it. And I know that it came perhaps from his life experience, But I think also, I didn't know him personally. We never met. I only heard him perform live once. That his personal convictions, his sense of justice and fairness and charity and helping those who are less fortunate, all of that informed his interpretations of songs. He was a handsome man. He didn't necessarily have the most fulfilling romantic life for reasons we can detail, or people will read your book and find the details. But I felt that when he did a song, whether he wrote it or someone else wrote it, he brought so much more to it than almost anyone. Yes, Ella Fitzgerald for me is the number one, Aretha Franklin number two, but after those two, I'm talking in the pop realm, then there's a whole bunch of singers, and George Michael is right up there with them, even more than Peggy Lee and Lena Horne, who I loved. And I didn't know Chet Baker singing enough to have any judgment on it. Talk about George Michael, the musician, because I just think he does not get the attention from the public that deserves.
I want to point out that you wrote about this very subject beautifully on WQXR.org. Isn't that correct in your column?
Yeah, when Michael died, yeah.
Well, so many things to address there. I often watch singers, especially classical singers. Through my life, I have been to recitals and I've heard recordings by singers who I felt were superbly well trained and sang very correctly, but did not have a natural gift for singing, so that the end result felt somewhat contrived and uncomfortable. And that could never be said of George Michael, because George was so naturally gifted with precisely the musicianship that you're talking about. But besides that, a sound that caressed the ear. It had a burnished texture to it, but a sweetness at the same time. It had an innate vulnerability. He had great rhythm, which is why he could sing R&B, and he could also swing, as he does on that album that you referenced called Songs from the Last Century, his standards album. George had all of these gifts from the first time he ever sang, as far as I can tell, and I don't think he ever had to think about it very much. There were singers like Lena and Peggy who were deeply cerebral singers, who thought things through, who pored over lyrics, in whose recordings, and in both of those two cases, I first heard Peggy Lee probably when I was 7 or 8 years old. And there are recordings that I heard at that time that I can still listen to today and hear things that I did not hear before. That is how deep and nuanced their artistry is. I think George Michael's artistry was a lot more natural than that. He simply had the gift for singing. And in that gift was an essential ability to make people feel good. There was something about the sound as it fell on the ear that gave you a little rush. And now, whenever I mention the name George Michael to anybody, immediately a smile comes over their face, because I get the feeling that when they hear that name, they hear his voice in their heads, and they hear whatever song it was associated with whatever sweet moment in their lives it may have been. And I've watched just a wave of happiness wash over them. And when I began seeing those reactions 5 years ago, when I signed to do this book, I knew that I was on the right track. And Fred, in spite of all the mishaps and the tragedy that befell him in his later life, isn't it wonderful that happy feeling overrides all of that stuff? It doesn't always, as you well know.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to say something, and you can disagree with me if you wish, feel free. Many other singers have gotten into trouble, let's put it that way, whether it's drugs or sex issues or money issue, whatever, gambling. And a lot of their offenses were very, very harmful. I think I'm right in saying that George Michael's offenses were mostly harmful to himself. And, you know, he may have been insecure and therefore tempestuous and difficult at times. But I've known many, many artists of all stripes who were like that. Igor Stravinsky was no walk in the park. So, but, you know, people are human and they bring their humanity with it. But what strikes me about George Michael is, and I feel bad for his legacy for this, is that people automatically lump him in with people, with other artists, musicians who did very serious harm to other people. The closest that George Michael got to, quote, harm is he was entrapped in a public restroom in Beverly Hills by a very handsome police officer who was set up for doing that. And it was half a block away from the police station, very close to a very fancy hotel. And it was entrapment, and he had to do community service, which he did for an AIDS charity to feed people with AIDS in Los Angeles. But that's kind of it, really. I mean, yes, he used drugs, but, you know, unfortunately, most people have used drugs and many people in the arts have used drugs. And therefore, I want the George Michael, who was a glorious musician, to be remembered as well, because he, you know, your book is very fair in that it documents what happened to him. But I never had the feeling reading your book or in my having feelings about George Michael as an artist that he was mean, that he was malevolent, that he sought to do harm to others. He was witty, in my experience, in a way that another artist who I adore, although he's difficult, is Mick Jagger, is very witty. And part of Mick Jagger's appeal is his wittiness. And George Michael, I think, was similarly witty. Am I on the right track with that?
Absolutely. There is a difference in perception of George between the UK and the US, however. Mm-hmm. George had a wonderful recording engineer named Johnny Douglas. And Johnny said to me in the course of my research that he felt that all of George's foibles had actually made him seem more sympathetic to the British public. I think and of course, the UK has the most brutal, invasive tabloids in the world. Ours are bad, theirs are worse. And yet, in the 1990s, when George started to falter very early in his career, in fact, in his late 20s, when George became enraged at his record label, Sony/CBS, and undertook to sue to get himself out of a contract that he had signed. It was a hopeless battle, and ultimately he lost, but he was out of the public eye somewhat and did not release a new album in 1991, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes. And then by the time he came back in 1996 with my favorite George Michael album called Older, pop music being as ephemeral as it is, George Michael had been replaced on that pedestal that he had fought so hard to attain. And then came that incident 2 years later in April of 1998 at Will Rogers Memorial Park in Beverly Hills, close to the West Hollywood border. And for a time there, George became a laughingstock in this country. And he never did regain the eminence that he had had before, which pained him very much. I will now segue a tiny bit and tell you that when George died, as you know, in 2016, Christmas Day, and I had been longing to write something about him, and I thought I will throw my hat in the ring because everyone is going to want to write this biography. And so I whipped up a proposal really fast, and my agent circulated it at the beginning of January. And January passed, and February passed, and March passed, and nobody wanted it. And I thought, it seemed to me that editors perceived him as being a fallen, disgraced figure from the mothball days of 1980s pop. And I seriously thought that this book was not going to happen, but a wonderful editor at Abrams, which became my publisher, Abrams, named David Cashion, who loved George Michael, fought it through.
I know
And
David Cashion.
he's a wonderful
He
editor.
worked on my Classical Music 101 book a long time ago. I didn't know that. Okay.
It's
good for
because
David.
of David that my book exists.
Good.
Anyway, so I went about my merry way and not so merry way writing this book. It was hard, Fred, really hard. Hardest thing I've ever done. But then the book came out on the 28th, and the response to it has overwhelmed me. The worldwide interest in this book. I've never known anything like this in my life. And it was then that I realized that I and David were right and they were all wrong.
Yep. Well, timing, it's a challenge that you and I have faced as writers for a long time. I often have proposed cookbooks that I know would be the next big thing. And editors have said, no, well, there's no one done a book like that. Yes, that's the point. Well, there's no audience for it. No, that's not true. And then 5 years later, a restaurant would open or a book would come out that would suddenly make Austrian cuisine, Scandinavian cuisine, which are two that I proposed, the next big thing in food. So similarly with musicians and biographies and so on, Jim, what I want to ask you about, and by the way, I'm thrilled to hear that David Cashion was your editor. That speaks a lot about David, because I think he's wonderful. I knew him at the very start of his career when he worked on one of my books.
Well, let me tell you what happened, Fred, because David unfortunately had to leave the company shortly after my book was signed, and a wonderful editor there named Chelsea Cutchins took up the reins and did a fabulous job. But I have to stress that if it were not for David Cashion, we would not be having this conversation now.
Good for David and good for Chelsea. Given that you've written towering biographies, I will say that, I want to know, number one, how you pick your subjects. And then the second question will be about your methods for how you do a biography. But let's start with how you pick your subjects and why are they all musicians?
Well, I fell in love with singers at the age of 5, excuse me. I learned to read when I was 4, and at the age of 5, I heard the first recording that spun my tiny little head around and made me fall in love with the human voice. It almost doesn't matter what the voice is singing, but again, if I'm touched by what the voice is singing, then I'm there. And may I tell you what the recording was?
Please.
We didn't have many records in the apartment in Yonkers where I grew up, but one that we did have was a grade overplayed Mercury Records 45 of Patti Page singing the Tennessee Waltz.
Sure.
That sweet, hokey little country tune with I didn't know it at the time, but the great jazz trumpeter Buck Clayton played this little trumpet solo. And there was Patti Page, an overdubbed Patti Page, a little choir of Patti Pages singing this song about rejection. That's a sad song. And what was it at the age of 5 years old that so drew me into a woman's voice singing sad songs? But that's how it all started. And from that point on, because I was a lonely kid, I didn't have a lot of friends. And so the voices on records became my friends. They were very real to me. As a matter of fact, I have here right by my left side, I have a couple of those albums right here. I'm going to hold them up to the screen. This is one of the albums that spun my head around. It's called Margaret Whiting Sings Rodgers and Hart.
Sure. Yeah.
And here's another one. Joe Stafford Sings American Folk Songs. 1948 and 1950, I believe. And I play those records to this day. Oops, sorry. I play those records to this day because the older that I get, you find this yourself, there are probably recordings that have been in your life since you were a child that still, and maybe even more than ever, move you. The older one gets, the more one experiences, the more you're capable of feeling what these great singers were singing about. And Jo Stafford, when she made those recordings, was in her early 30s, and Margaret would have been about 23 when she made that Rodgers and Hart album. But those voices struck me as so wise and so knowing. And I have always felt, to finally address your question, that I'm attracted to subjects in my articles and in these books where I feel that by researching them and by delving deeply into these people's lives, that I can find answers to questions about myself. Because I think that if I'm so drawn to what I'm hearing in that recording, then there must be answers. There must be clues in there to what's going on inside of me. And that was the case with all of my subjects.
Great. And I'm just going to push a little further that many of these artists didn't sing their own compositions, but they sang music written by fantastic musicians, composers, and librettists. And I think a lot of your work, I know your work for years, even before I met you, relates to the words in these songs and not specifically the music. In my world, of the opera world, let's say, it's music first, prima la musica, poi le parole. First the music, then the words. And the words were the source of inspiration for the sounds that the composers created. And it was to tell a story, not always in a moment, that's lieder, an art song, but to move forward the narrative in an opera, which is a different thing. It's like a novel that's sung or a play that's sung. But I know that you have had always a very strong knowledge and attraction to what is called cabaret. Talk about cabaret, but also how, if you agree with me, the words come first in cabaret and the music second, or am I wrong?
You're absolutely right. Many of the most powerful voices in cabaret are ravaged voices. The most famous example of that would be Mabel Mercer, who started her career in England with a pale soprano, a light. It wasn't interesting. I mean, it perhaps some magic took place in person when you went to see Mabel in the 1930s, and she could still sing in her original soprano, but it didn't have any of the magic that the later Mabel Mercer had, starting in the, I would say, mid to late 40s, when singing in smoky and oftentimes loud bar settings every night had taken a toll on its voice and started to chip away at it. Somehow it was like a sculpture, a big block of clay, and the beautiful figure began to emerge underneath all of those layers, of those nondescript layers. And so I must confess, I do enjoy hearing ruined voices. I think it can be very interesting, and that goes for any genre of music at all. But cabaret, okay, that in my teenage years, I spent a great deal of time at the library, the Yonkers Public Library, looking through old magazines like Stereo Review and High Fidelity that had all these reviews. That's where I learned of the existence of most of the great opera singers, by reading those reviews in those magazines and making mental notes of who I thought I'd better get to know. And these, and who knows where this impulse came from, but I wanted to be sophisticated. I wanted to be superior. I wanted to be self-schooled, and I wanted to have good manners, and I wanted to set myself apart from my schoolmates. And this music became a channel through which I felt I could do that. So I was reading about people like Mabel Mercer in the pages of old New Yorker magazines and old Stereo Review magazines, and I got the idea that the real smart people, the insiders, the real New York sophisticates, and New York was it, baby. Although I was born in New York, I was adopted, so I grew up in Yonkers, and yet dreamed of living in New York again because I wanted to be in the intellectual and artistic fast lane. And so I began learning about the existence of all these little clubs that had been all over New York City, where the smartest people went, the people who were really insiders. And a lot of those clubs were back rooms and basements. They were out of the way. You had to know where to find them, and you had to have the desire to be in these special places, a lot of which were dumps, but it didn't matter. And Mabel Mercer sang in a lot of dumps and a lot of clubs, or a few anyway, that were more elegant than that. But she had a grandeur about her that elevated her surroundings and that made everyone around her feel special, feel better than. And so it became my goal in life to be part of that world, whatever it took. And I was, let me think, I was about 19 years old and wandering around the streets of Greenwich Village, and I came across a little place on Cornelia Street near Bleecker in Greenwich Village called Jan Wallman's, run by one of the veteran stalwarts of the cabaret world. And I saw in the window an ad for a singer named Barbara Lee, a jazz cabaret singer, saluting Mabel Mercer. And I was so excited. And I went back a couple of weeks later and caught that show. And there I sat in this, it was a dump with a loud refrigerator and about capacity for 25 people, and nothing auspicious about it at all. But I felt that I had arrived, and I fell in love with this kind of minimalist entertainment, usually with just piano, maybe with a trio, but something, a kind of singing that was so geared toward nuance and interpretation and life experience, it must be said, as you pointed out, sometimes at the expense of the music, because it was all about storytelling set to music. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of singing became a gold standard for me in my mind. And I respond to that intimacy in any kind of singing that I hear, including opera, because there are opera singers, as you know better than anyone, who still have that, even at the Metropolitan Opera, who have the ability to make us feel as though we're in that little garret or we're in that bedroom and we're eavesdropping on the action. And I'm getting goosebumps as I say that.
Renee Fleming does that very, very well.
Oh, indeed she does.
In terms of creating intimacy in a huge room when she sings. It's true.
I agree.
Now, I mean, if I had to think of one, and Renee Fleming began actually by singing Duke Ellington. It's interesting. I'll have to ask her sometime how and if that informed her opera presentation, that her beginnings were actually singing Duke Ellington.
Very good point.
Yeah.
I bet it does.
Interesting. So there's so much you raised that I can want to talk about. I think the next thing I want to say, though, and please talk about this if you would, is I also know for a fact that all of those cabaret performers and people in the cabaret world see you as kind of their Boswell, and they trust you, because these are people who are laying out vulnerabilities of the first order in the songs they choose. Frankly, the songs they choose tend to be mirrors and expressions of what they're experiencing in life. And I'm familiar with these singers as performers, but not their lives. And I know that several times I've been to performances of cabaret type music where I knew nothing about the singer, and I would be impressed by her. Wesla Whitfield was one of them. And I called you up after and asked you all about her because I had no idea her backstory, which we don't have to tell now. But just the fact that many of these singers have been through a lot. And it's interesting, I suppose, because I love singers who really move me musically and do a lot with the words, but move me musically. You are talking about singers who do a lot, who move you emotionally on a lyrics level. And you've acquired, I know this, many admirers in the world of cabaret and pop music who read you because you understand them, perhaps in a way that I understand opera singers. But it's interesting because these are similar worlds, but different worlds.
Well,
in a lot of ways.
The book you alluded to earlier, which gave me my life, the book called Intimate Nights, The Golden Age of New York Cabaret, which I began writing 1 year after the incident that I just described at Jan Wallman's. I was a junior in college, Fordham University, and I wanted desperately to be a writer, and I wanted desperately to write about singers. And I found a way to put the two of them together in that book. And I started absolutely from scratch. No resume, no cred, no agent, no publisher, but a lot of desire. And about 2.5 years passed before I got a deal with Grove Press, which was a miracle because they were absolutely taking a chance on me. I was so young and inexperienced, and yet that book, which has been in 3 different editions, it somehow lives on because there's no other book like it that tells the story that it tells. And so what I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, I want to make only a slight detour here because as you were speaking just now about your eagerness to be musically moved, you had asked me if I would pick 5 great performances in the Adagio catalog.
Mm-hmm.
One of those performances, I think, speaks to what you were just discussing, and that is the recording, the wordless recording of Anna Moffo singing Rachmaninoff's Vocalise. And that is, again, I'm getting goosebumps even as I say that recording because it may be the last sound I ever hear. Anna Moffo singing that piece of music, because she is as expressive without words as any singer could be with words.
Yep. Well, since we're talking about your selections, I find it, I mean, I love them all. Let's just start with that. That one of the ones you picked is a great, great opera singer. And Mr. Turville, if you're listening, you're welcome on the show anytime. Bryn Tervel, who recently has been singing Falstaff in Zurich. Singing a song by Alan J. Lerner and Charles Strauss. Bryn Tervel, magnificent opera singer, Wotan and Boris Godunov and Falstaff and Figaro, you name it, and Don Giovanni and Leporello, can also really sing so-called popular music. Not every opera singer can. Another one, I don't know if you know her, who I will name, an American soprano named Leah Crocetto, who's a terrific opera singer for Italian music mostly, but she's from Michigan. But also, if you unleash the American popular song on her, what you get is fabulous singing, but also interpretation of the words.
Yes.
So it is possible for some of these opera singers to do that, and Bryn Tervel is one of them. You also picked the Samuel Barber Violin Concerto. Anna Moffo doing a vocalise, and I take your point about the sound. Susan Graham, fabulous singer, of course, singing a song by Ned Rorem. Talk about Ned Rorem, because many people don't know who he is, and Ned Rorem is both a composer and a writer, and someone you've come to know very well through your work and through your life.
As a college boy, I worked at the Barnes and Noble on 18th Street and Fifth Avenue.
A major bookstore.
A major bookstore indeed. And I was there for 2 years. And on a big table in that Barnes and Noble were the beautiful reissued versions of the Paris and New York Diaries of Ned Rorem. And I saw that book, and like so many people before me, I was captivated by the face on the cover. And I flipped through it, and I was equally captivated by the dry wit and the erudition and the worldliness and the staunch dedication to so many adjectives that I can name. But Ned was a real New Yorker of a high level. He was a true sophisticate and absolutely dedicated to his work, in addition to all the other things Ned is known for. And so I made a mental note of my little wish list of dream people that I would someday meet, and Ned Rorem was near the top of that list. Cut to 2003, and a dear friend of mine in Santa Barbara, the author Richard Lamparsky, author of many books called Whatever Became Of, that I grew up on, he likes to wave his magic wand and make nice things happen for his friends. And although he barely knew Ned Rorem, he knew Ned Rorem very slightly, and he sent Ned a note about me, describing me and expressing the desire that he should meet me. Imagine that. Now, you referenced the Upper West Side, where I live in New York, and Ned lives 11 blocks south of where I live. And Ned Rorem invited me to one in a series that he was hosting at the 92nd Street Y across the park, Central Park, in which he interviewed other composers on stage. Ned invited me to that, and then subsequently I went to visit him at his apartment, and seek and ye shall find, Fred, because that began a very pivotal friendship in my life that lasts to this day, in which I got to bask in the world of Ned Rorem, which is a world of artists and superb conversation. And because Ned is a great conversationalist with a real curiosity and flair for listening. And I got to observe Ned's I was about to say I got to observe his work techniques, but that wouldn't be quite true, because Ned didn't make a big deal out of any of that. His work was something that he did and he cared about deeply, but he did and does not feel the desire to tell you too much about it. I witnessed the results, and I have so many fond memories of my almost 20-year friendship with Ned Rorem, in which I met the creme de la creme of the intellectual, artistic, social world of New York City. And in the year, it came out in 2000, so it precedes my meeting Ned, but I heard a great deal from Ned about a beautiful album recorded by Susan Graham of his songs, which he was immensely proud of, because he felt that, well, he had utmost respect for her artistry, for her respect for his music, and for her, how should I say this, for her non-interference in his intentions, because Ned Ned was not and is not a fan of too much interpretation. He feels that he's written it into the music, and if you just sing what he's written, the rest will follow, which is not in any way to which is not in any way to denigrate Susan's wonderful interpretive gifts, but the combination of that and Ned's music produced a magical album that I think he felt was the definitive portrait of his song composing.
The other selection on the list, and then I invite listeners to go and listen to all these on the show page, a Serenade by Charles Gounod, sung by countertenor David Daniels.
One of my favorite singers, a sublime artist. And when you were talking earlier about the intimacy that certain singers can bring to their work, regardless of the space they're singing in, I was thinking about David, because David's singing is superbly nuanced and expressive. He, more than any other countertenor, taught me about the potential of the countertenor voice, and he has broadened the countertenor repertoire. He's widened its boundaries and shown how much music can sound beautiful when sung in a countertenor voice. I love listening to him, but I also love watching him because his joy in making music shows on his face. And he has so many faces as a singer, so many different moods that he can draw upon. And I think that David Daniels is one of the great opera singers and one of the great song singers as well. And I have every recital album he's done, and I will listen to that music until the end of my life.
I'm with you. Jim, you touched on something in your most recent response that I think it's important to pick up this thread more, because it's something that you and I can talk about in shorthand, but maybe people elsewhere would not get the shorthand. And I think it's important that we tease it out a bit. It's the following. You and I are New Yorkers by birth and by upbringing. We come from working class families. We didn't have so-called privileges necessarily. We had public education. You went to a good Jesuit college in New York City. I went outside of New York City and mostly to Italy because that's what I needed to do. But, and also it was a lot cheaper in terms of tuition in Italy than it would have been here. But New York is not necessarily what people elsewhere think it is. Namely, there is a social mobility and fluidity. There is not the definition of class structure that you have in London or in the UK, where people immediately talk about your class. In New York, we are of all backgrounds. Sometimes it helps to be good looking, but that doesn't get you too far. What really is the currency is talent. And I'm what I call an Arethaologist, that I can quote anything from Aretha Franklin of every type. And she was rather Buddha-like and elliptical, and she didn't necessarily speak directly, but if you listen to what Aretha said, she was right, almost always. And someone asked Aretha, what is talent? And she paused and she said, it means you've got something going on. And she's right. And she's right. And the thing is that Ned Rorem was interested in James Gavin because you have something going on. And one of the things that I love in New York City, yes, there are people who sadly, for whatever reason, are blocked from access and entry, even though we tend to have more access and entry than many places. But there is a blending in New York City that results in culinary creations and musical and artistic creations and stupidity as well, and crassness and bad taste as well, and rampant commercialism that creates ugliness. I will never pretend any of that doesn't exist. It does. But the fact that when I was 9 years old, I met Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis in Central Park and got to know her. And I knew her throughout the rest of her life, periodically, not constantly. And I was just a kid with a tennis racket. And I could name many people where it sounds like not name dropping, but throwing names to the ground. And that's really not the point. The point is that if you are interested in learning stuff and being exposed to new things, New York is incredibly generous in that, not just in the arts, but sort of whatever it is you're interested in. We have in New York City what I was taught in school in sixth grade is called the ladder. I don't know if they taught this in Yonkers, but in New York City, we're taught about the ladder, namely that if you are an immigrant family and have just arrived from Mexico, from Ukraine, from Bangladesh, wherever, and you're at the bottom rung of the ladder, the people on the ladder above you need to not only get themselves up, but to pull you up with them. And we see this, for example, in food markets, that many years ago it was the Italians and the Greeks. Then it became the Koreans, then it became the Mexicans, and it'll be someone else soon. And because these people pull one another up by giving jobs to newly arrived people. In New York, immigration is a source of incredible wealth and richness. And there is no majority here. We are all New Yorkers. And, you know, someone like Donald Trump may inveigh against that, but he's really the exception. Even, and I don't get political on these shows too much, but Rudolph Giuliani, I'm no fan, but he always spoke positively about immigration and understood its worth in the city and what it brings. So that when you can say that you met Ned Rorem, and I can name people who I've met, I never did meet Aretha Franklin, unfortunately, but that's one of the few. And I would have asked her a lot of questions about music, but you know, I met Ella Fitzgerald, Tony Bennett, and not just met to shake their hand, but really talk to them. And Tony Bennett is a wonderful example of a New Yorker who has so generously given by creating schools and naming them not for Tony Bennett, but for Frank Sinatra, by doing art exhibitions, by going out and doing public demonstrations in support of racial equality. He's to me practically the gold standard of that, in that he came from working class Queens. He had talents as a musician, extraordinary talents, but also as a painter, and understood that it's about the latter. It's about giving back and helping along the next people. And am I expressing the New York that you know?
God, yes. While you were speaking just now, a quote popped into my head that was spoken to me by Anita O'Day. I interviewed her in the late 90s.
Say who that was. Not everyone knows.
Sure. Anita O'Day is one of the pivotal pioneers of jazz singing, cool jazz singing, starting in the big band era and then moving into the 1950s. Anita O'Day was the queen of the cool school, as it was called, of jazz singers. She had her thriving career, and she had her heroin addiction for many years, as so many jazz and bebop musicians had, but she got past it ultimately. And Anita O'Day had more than 9 lives, and she went through them all and then some. And I interviewed her after she had just triumphed over her most recent near-death experience, and which had taken her from a fetal position on a sofa, on a hospital bed, rather, unable to, and then a sofa, unable to speak or to sing, to headlining at the JVC Jazz Festival again. And whoops, I just dropped my water, Fred. I got so excited there. But Anita said something to me that I will never forget, and I repeat it to myself about 3 times a week. She said, "You got to have desire, man," which I think is one of the wisest things I have ever heard. And I had that desire, and you had it. Where does it come from? Is there any explaining why we were so driven to take the path that we take? I don't know. I don't know. I just had a tremendous need to, I wanted to blow my own mind. I wanted to be around the smartest people that I could possibly be around, because I felt that there was so much to learn out there. And I was gifted with a tremendous curiosity, which also gave me my life. And for me, New York City was the center of my dreams, without a doubt. It was the only place that I wanted to be, could be happy. And I still feel that way. For all of my issues about New York, I don't know what place on earth would make me happier. I love a lot of other places. You love a lot of other places. But what city on earth has more of what we need to be happy than New York has? If it's out there, I don't know what it is.
I do.
What is it? Tell me.
No. I'm just but
I want to know.
I can tell you that, when to riff on Anita O'Day, and she loved to riff, I would say that my desire is that I love to learn. And if I'm learning, I feel good. If I'm not learning in some form or another, I don't feel good. And
Right.
learning can come in many, many forms. And I'm not a depressive person, but the only time I can report being genuinely depressed is when I finished graduate school and I knew that that's it for my formal education. And I took to bed for about a week. And then I got out of bed and I said, okay, you can keep learning. You're just going to do it differently, but you have to keep learning. And in my case, keep moving. The pandemic for me has been a challenge because I'm used to being out in the world. And my New York City is the New York City that's juxtaposed with the place that I'm in, if it's somewhere else. So that, for example, I could go to Bologna, Italy, and experience all kinds of things that New York could never give me, and get enough opera and other music that I'm very happy in Bologna. And Bologna, Italy in general, but Bologna in particular, there's something in every country that I call the national conversation. And somehow I don't really connect to the national conversation in the United States at all, unfortunately. I do connect to the New York City conversation, but I very much connect to the national conversation in Italy. People talk about things that I care about. And that's why, in that way only, New York just doesn't do it for me. There are people here who I love to talk to, but it's, to me, New York, it's about the learning, not about the interaction. And
But,
there are distinctions there.
but overall, would you want to live in Bologna, or would you want to keep New York as your home base?
I want two bases. I have lived in Bologna. I would go back
I
there in a
see.
second. But not only, there are other world cities that feel very much home to me. And I'll name one that, and we'll get back to George Michael with this, that for all the years that I've spent living, studying, working in London, and I have many, many wonderful friends in London, London always feels like a foreign city to me in ways that it's not like a New York with a few differences. They're profoundly different cities, New York and London. And to me, Paris and New York are much closer in temperament and approach than London and New York are. And Italy, for me, is a thing apart. Italy is a large part of who I am that lies mostly dormant in New York City. And it's only really awakened when I'm there. And I always say to my loved ones and friends who are loved ones that if you really want to know me, you have to see me in Italy to really understand. It's not because the food is better and the clothing is great. It's just different. And there are whole aspects of me that really only come alive there, that otherwise people don't see. And for that reason, yes, I'm a proud New Yorker. I love what New York has given me, and I love what I can give New York and try to do on a daily basis. But it's not my fulfillment, to put it that way.
Okay. Well, there are cities that I adore, like Rio, Salvador Bahia, because Brazil is a big part of my life, Sydney, Australia, Los Angeles, and others that I could name, where I've left pieces of my heart. But by and large, the thought of ever living in one of them, I can't imagine it, Fred. I mean, you are such a New Yorker. You are everything
People
about you
say
to
that. I
me.
know, but I see it less. Everyone else, says when they think of the typical New Yorker, they think of me. And I want to say, well, no, that's Jim Gavin. It's not me. But since you mentioned Rio, you and I had a 2-second conversation many years ago that I never picked the thread up on. So we're going to do it now. We are good friends, and I admire you immensely for many things, including your knowledge of and your passion for music. That said, I will take the music of Argentina over the music of Brazil any day.
Oh, interesting.
Now go for it.
The
Tell me
music,
why the music of Brazil.
– – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – Mostly what we know here in the States is 1960s bossa nova. much of which reached us after bossa nova in Brazil had actually peaked. Musicians here, jazz musicians, know a handful of songs that typically by Antonio Carlos Jobim that date from that era, but the music of Brazil is as big as Brazil, and every state and every major city has its own musical flair and musical contribution, an infinity of rhythms, an infinity of voices. And music is what drew me to Brazil in the first place. I fell in love with Brazilian music in the 90s primarily, and I was so drawn to the quality that I hear in so much Brazilian music, which is the smile that hides the tear. That is my definition.
Saudade.
Yes, yes, exactly. Which is an almost untranslatable word meaning a kind of indefinable longing for something that isn't there.
Well, for our German listeners, and there are many, the word is Sehnsucht, Sehnsucht. When I'm asked, when I'm teaching Schubert or something, and the word, or Richard Strauss, whomever, and the word Sehnsucht comes up, people say, well, what is that? I say, it's saudade. Well, what is it in English? We need 30 words to say it, but only in Portuguese and German does the word really exist. I don't want to give the wrong impression. I love the music of Brazil. And when I've been there, I can tell you right before September 11, 2001, I was in Rio. I was working at the Opera House in Rio at the Teatro Municipal, and really did a very deep dive into Brazilian music, though I was working on Lohengrin by Wagner. And it's extraordinary. And I went to a concert once by Tina Turner in Maracanã Stadium in Rio, which I believe holds 220,000 people. And what struck me was that Brazilians by the thousands brought musical instruments to the concert. And when she was not singing, they were playing music in the crowd, not just, music here, music there, but you'd suddenly hear all the horns playing the same thing, and then all the drums throughout the stadium responding in other ways. It was thrilling. You don't have that in Argentina, even at the soccer games, at the football matches. But I think what draws me in Argentina, it could be chord structure. It could be the sexiness that I find in tango that's different from the sexiness of Brazilian music, which is a little more George Michael, a little more mellow and laid back and beautiful, gorgeous, but just of a different flavor. I mean, let's get back to George Michael, who wrote a song called I Want Your Sex. And he was very overt in talking about sexuality, not necessarily his, although it might have been his, but communicating sensuality in his music that is irresistible, but without driving, pounding. I'm not saying Brazil or Argentina is this, but his approach was very, very bossa nova, I think one could say, in certain ways.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because the love of his life was a Brazilian man named Anselmo Falepa, who died a year and a half after George met him of AIDS. And in fact, they really only had 6 months of fairy tale bliss together. George met Anselmo in Rio when he, George, went to do a festival called Rock in Rio, 2 concerts, the only time he ever sang in Brazil. And he met this angel from on high, which is how he perceived Anselmo. And the tragedy that this man was taken away from him so quickly, and that they really only had, as I said, a year and a half together, and that's all. And George felt that the floor had been pulled out from underneath him. And he made this album that is responsible for my falling in love with the music of George and with his story, called Older. This was his first album. I alluded to this earlier, but this was his first album in, let's see, Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1 came out in 1990. And then in 1996, finally came this album, which is very Brazilian influenced, very bossa nova, sad, mellow, pulsing, pained, melancholy music, and the songs on that album are almost like diary entries. George felt that he was laying bare his life. He felt that he was coming out to the public in a not crystal clear way, but close enough. And he felt, I believe, that in writing these songs and singing them, he could bring Anselmo back to life. And this album, which was number one, as almost everything George did in England, in the US flopped. It was incredibly wounding to him because he felt that he was finally telling people and showing people in this country, the US, who he really was. And they wanted the George Michael that they had known.
The shiny pop star.
Yeah. The shiny pop star whom they could dance to. Yeah. That was very, very hurtful to George. Very hurtful.
You know, in American English, we have an expression that's very suitable to George Michael in this case, and sad, but it's funny too. When someone is being completely ignored, we say he couldn't get arrested in this town, meaning that he's being that ignored. And nonetheless, the only thing that many people associate George Michael with is being arrested in Beverly Hills. And that, I mean, he was on the David Letterman show talking about it. And he was on, I think the name is Michael Atkinson, a big presenter in Britain. I'm not sure of the name, but I think Michael Atkinson. Parkinson, yes.
Yeah.
And he was asked endlessly about it. And okay, you have to address it. And he was very forthcoming, and he described it as entrapment. And he said, it is what it is, and I am who I am. And, you know, in the great scheme of things, I didn't harm anyone. And they sent this very handsome cop in a public restroom in Los Angeles, police officer, to in effect entrap him. And it leads to a question about his relationship to the media. And when I say the media, I don't mean serious journalists. I mean the greater entertainment complex that somehow blurs news and entertainment and gossip. And it exists in magazines and many television shows, and certain so-called quality newspapers can work in the gossip as well. And he was a friend of Princess Diana, who suffered greatly through the media. Oh, she benefited from it too, and died being pursued by journalists, by photographers, really, in Paris. And how did George feel about, and how, frankly, did Lena and Peggy and your other subjects, anyone you want to name, feel about their relationship with the media? And I mentioned that in part because of what I said to you before, that you have gained the trust of most of the performers you write about. And that makes you rather distinct among, quote, the media.
What George didn't know as a child, when he probably at the age of 7 or 8, made this pact with himself that he was going to become big. By that, I mean a superstar. He wanted to be the biggest star. And what he didn't realize is that you are the fine print of that contract that you sign, especially in England, where the tabloid, for all the supposed gentility of the English, they have the most brutal and intrusive gotcha tabloids in the world. And George didn't know, and most of those stars didn't know, that the moment that you become of big interest, that they will be on your tail for anything that they can find. And some superstars, Diana being one of them, figured out ways to get in bed with the media to their mutual advantage. But George had a big secret that others did not have. Elton had it for a time. But the fact that George was gay and in the closet and had created a George Michael who was this macho heterosexual sex god whose audience was primarily girls, he had something to hide. And something interesting that I discovered as I sat for many, many days at the British Library, my favorite library in the world, in front of a terminal, and I looked back through the pages of all of those tabloid columns that had written gossip about George Michael. I was surprised to find that for a time, I would say from the days of Wham, 1983, 4, 5, and 6, through certainly the early 90s, those tabloids just wanted dish, and they were all too happy to print these alleged about talk about these alleged relationships that George had had with all these sexy girls. They didn't care if it was true or not. They just wanted to fill those column inches with stuff that would sell newspapers. It wasn't until probably about 1992, 3, 4, that they started to back off from that and move in on the fact that George was, everybody knew it, that he was gay, but George had not come out of the closet in the way that people were increasingly wanted. And as the 90s went on, there was enormous pressure for gay celebrities to join rank and speak out. And George, like many gay celebrities in the closet, was petrified of doing so for two reasons. One, he saw the possible destruction of everything that he had fought to achieve since he was a kid. And two, and it's sad to say this, but he had not, until 1993 and the death of Anselmo, he hadn't come out to his parents. And when Anselmo died, he couldn't hold it in anymore. And he wrote them a letter in which he came out to them. His father hated it, and his mothers always know, and she loved him all the more and became all the more protective and wanting for him to be happy. But the more George handed the tabloids scandal on a silver platter, more and more so as he went on through life and began increasingly spiraling out of control due to drugs and depression. And so to this day, George's life, because it was written with so much scandal, is of tremendous interest to the tabloids. And my book got a cringy but gigantic push forward because the Daily Mail, biggest selling newspaper in the UK, did a 2-page spread on my book in which all of the most salacious tidbits of my book were strung together into one big messy article. And while it was painful to see my effort reduced to that on the one hand, on the other hand, the Daily Mail is the Daily Mail. Its readership buys it for that reason. And it spread the word about my book worldwide. And I can certainly thank the Daily Mail for that. And now that reviews of my book are coming along that represent what I try to do in a more balanced light, maybe the two things will even out. But George's relationship with the tabloids was what all big British celebrities encountered, and that is that you need them, you hate them, but you need them. And the best thing to do is find a way to get along with them, because you will never get rid of them. As long as you're living a life that is of interest in popular culture, that's the way it's going to be.
So you mentioned Wham. Would you briefly talk about what Wham was and who Andrew Ridgeley is? And then I'm going to read a little section of your book to our audience.
Thanks, Fred. Wham was the boy group, two boys, two schoolmates in North London, Andrew Ridgeley and George Michael, who created the biggest boy band in England for the years that I mentioned earlier, 83 through 86. Wham was a stadium-filling sensation in UK primarily, somewhat in the US. They had a couple of big hits here, including Careless Whisper, which was mostly George, not Andrew, and various other countries.
Wake Me Up Before You Go Go.
Precisely, yes. That was one of the big breakthrough songs. And also in the Far East, in Japan, they loved Wham there. China, big in the George Michael story. Wham went going to China. But in a nutshell, George was this dweeby, pimply, glasses wearing, very painfully, excruciatingly insecure kid who saw this super cool guy in school named Andrew Ridgeley, who had swagger and confidence and knew how to put an outfit together and was detached and cool and above it all. And George saw in Andrew Ridgeley a template for what he wanted to be. And so George Michael he modeled the George Michael character that he created on Andrew. Did it matter that Andrew had minimal musical talent? Not really, because if it were not for Andrew, George did all the heavy lifting, musically speaking, in the group. And if it were not for Andrew, there would not have been any Wham, and quite possibly would never have been a George Michael.
And their farewell was at Wembley Stadium?
In England, it sure as hell was, and that was one of the sensations of the decade.
So that leads me to read a passage, being an Arethaologist, from your book. Even before the Wembley farewell, George Michael would be making his solo recording debut with the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, an extraordinary coup. Franklin was riding high with a platinum album, Who's Zooming Who, and a Grammy-winning hit single, Freeway of Love, and a great video, by the way. Potential songs for Franklin poured into Clive Davis, president of her label, Arista. One of them was a dance tune, I Knew You Were Waiting for Me, co-authored by Simon Climie, who had written the Pat Benatar top 10 hit Invincible. His partner, Dennis Morgan, came from Nashville. Clive Davis already had his eye on a George Michael duet, but not with Franklin. Instead, he proposed Arista's skyrocketing golden girl, Whitney Houston. But Michael found Houston singing mechanical and cold. Shooting for the stars, he suggested Aretha Franklin instead and got her. Michael knew she liked him when Wake Me Up, his song, was on the charts. She had communicated a request for him to write and produce a single for her. Out of intimidation, Michael declined. Now she was willing, even eager to sing with him. Franklin was revamping herself as a modern dance diva, and he had the audience she wanted. Michael, in turn, wanted further soul cred, and nothing could provide it like a duet with Aretha Franklin. To produce, Clive Davis chose Narada Michael Walden, the hotshot who had masterminded Aretha's Who's Zooming Who. It took the notoriously difficult and moody Aretha Franklin months to commit to a session. Finally, time was slated for May. Accompanied by Rob Kahane, George Michael flew to Detroit near her home for 2 days of recording. Michael phoned Andros from the studio, which stood in the neighborhood that had made him shudder. He reckoned at first that they were trying to scare him off. Then, after a while, hanging out with the crowd, he said he felt like, quote, the acceptable honky, meaning white person. But Kahane got a sense of how Franklin's crowd actually perceived him. The agent had brought a video camera, and at the studio, he asked members of Franklin's entourage to comment on George Michael. They'd say, who? No one knew who he was. For Michael, this session was an anointing. For Franklin, it was a gig. George said, she wasn't cold to me, she just seemed unimpressed by everything. George told Rob Tannenbaum, the musician. Franklin placed an order for baby back ribs, and she perked up when they arrived, wrapped in newspaper. She laid the heap on Michael's lap. She'd put the whole rib in her mouth across the room, take all the meat off the bone, said Kahane, and then would toss the remains across the room into a bucket, always hitting the bullseye. When Michael rose, everyone could see the line of grease across his crotch. Franklin entered the booth to sing a solo part. She's belting out the song, said Kahane, just killing it. She stopped and said, Narada, you know I can do much better than that. Michael turned to Kahane. I want to go, he said. There's no way I'm going to be able to sing like that. The agent had to talk him into staying. Franklin wanted to sing with him at the same mic. As the tape rolled, he stood opposite her, just freaking out, he said, because she was treating me like an equal. He wasn't impressed by the accompaniment, which sounded like routine 80s pop, twinkly synthesizer, and a backbeat that pounded out a medium dance groove. But it didn't hold Franklin back. She plunged into the gravelly depths and then swooped raspily to heaven. Her partner delivered breathy pillow talk punctuated by growls and wails. So, Jim, that writing works on so many levels. Number one, we are there with them. Number two, your musical expertise explains what was going on musically. The notion of Aretha Franklin being diffident is spot on. The notion of Aretha eating baby back ribs and tossing the bones away perfectly into a bucket, spot on. George Michael being intimidated by her and having pork grease on his lap, spot on. But then the fact that he didn't like the orchestrations, the fact that he brought his musical sensibility there, the fact that Aretha understood that this is one of the few people around who could challenge her and make her better. All of that is in those 4 paragraphs, which is a remarkable feat of writing. But talk about what it says about George.
You know, there's one point that just occurred to me that I wanted to make earlier, and that is, as much as George was infatuated with Motown and rhythm and blues and soul of the 1960s, and as much as he revered a singer like Aretha Franklin, he wasn't trying to imitate them. Now, Elton, I must say, did purloin all of those vocal mannerisms from old soul records. It worked for him, but it was sounded very artificial to my ears, and George didn't do that. George sang like George. He did not pronounce words in a certain way because he thought that that's what soul singers did. He had such a firm sense of himself as a singer. And although he, as a songwriter, he was tremendously influenced by the music that he loved. As a singer, I don't know who you could even compare him to because he doesn't sound like anybody else. And it's not because he is overly stylized. He's not at all. When I think of a lot of the great Brazilian singers I love, one of the aspects of Brazilian music across the board is that the delivery is oftentimes very plain. It's not ornamented delivery. And George was not interested in ornamented delivery because he didn't have to. He had that core thing inside here that doesn't need decoration. And if I were to fathom a guess, I would say that's one of the reasons why Aretha accepted him, because he wasn't trying to compete with her. He wasn't trying to be her. He wasn't trying to be phony. He was so much himself.
And yet Aretha, who was in a category of 1, only Ella Fitzgerald in my ranking is above her, could do melismas. She could interpolate in the moment. She was profoundly improvisational and instinctive. And somehow they were able to merge that. There's another singer who much later in George's career, he did a duet with that I absolutely adore. Stevie Wonder's As, which is one of the most romantic songs ever written. It could be sung at a wedding ceremony instead of Wagner's Wedding March or instead of Mendelssohn and be just as good. And Mary J. Blige has a very, I think, by choice, rough, growly, fantastic, thrilling, sexy sound that's completely opposite from George's very legato, very, George could have sung certain kinds of lieder if he wanted to. An art song. I think he would have been wonderful at Henri Duparc. In French art songs would have been his strength more than the German or the Italian repertory. But I think that he could have done an album of French art songs. Berlioz' Les Nuits d'été, he would have been perfect at. But he brings that sound. He brings the Stevie Wonder side, in effect, to this duet with Mary J. Blige. And George, among the many things I loved about his work, was he did wonderful music videos that push the edge, not in terms of overproduction a la Michael Jackson, not in terms of pushing the edge thematically like Madonna, although both of them, Michael Jackson and Madonna, did great videos. But I think the third one in that group in the 80s and early 90s in terms of quality of music videos was George Michael, who often didn't appear in his videos, we just would see him in profile. And it was about other people. They were films, in effect. And unlike Michael Jackson dancing or Madonna dancing and singing and dressing up, George Michael was almost like the filmmaker in his videos. And an exception, though, is, as with Mary J. Blige, in which we see one George Michael, but then he telescopes into dozens of George Michaels, and we see one Mary J. Blige, and then she becomes many. And there are these crowds of people who look just like two individuals. It's fascinating as a video, and it, in effect, creates the chorus that backs up this duet. So that's just my impression on that. But again, it's George singing in his own way rather than imitating others, the point you made. But when, after Freddie Mercury died of AIDS and he was the lead singer of Queen, George Michael sang with Queen and did a pop concert, a fundraiser, as he did many, and he sang Queen's Find Me Somebody to Love, I think infinitely better than Freddie Mercury ever sang it. Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, Elton John's song, he sang better than Elton John. This is just my opinion. But the point is, he never imitated. I'm grasping on your point that he was always singing as George would sing. And it's a crucial point because he wasn't imitating. He was just his essential artistic self, no matter the music.
I wonder how many people look to that genre of big commercial pop singing as a bastion of great singing, because it's about so many other things besides the kind of refined singing that you and I ultimately love the most. Whitney, of course, despite George's reservations about her, delivered on that level. Aretha, I wouldn't place as a commercial pop singer, but we're talking about voices that were towering voices in that field who really do stand up against the greatest singers in any genre, don't they?
But Aretha's musicianship, the fact that she, like Mabel Mercer, accompanied herself on the piano, and the piano became an additional musical element when Aretha played, and Mabel Mercer, in that they could comment with the keyboard on things that they were singing about. And no one did that to me better than Aretha in pop, in quote, popular music.
But Aretha, growing up in the church, was like a sponge. And so she absorbed the stylistic qualities of gospel music. They were in her blood. And years later, when singers like Mariah Carey adopted those.
So, Jim, you have frozen. When Mariah Carey adopted, we're going to get you back. There you are. Jim, I don't know if you heard me, but you froze on when Mariah Carey, what?
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
I said that Mariah Carey, probably more than any other, she's the first one I remember who adopted those melismatic soul mannerisms, and I think bastardized and vulgarized them to a degree that spread all over popular music and made that the way that a lot of that singing sounded. And Aretha Franklin's use of those devices was, again, in her blood. It was absolutely authentic. And I don't think that she had a phony musical bone in her.
No. Mariah Carey has said, although I'm not particularly a Mariah Careyologist, but I gather that her mother was an opera singer, but I don't know any of the details of that.
Well, none of that rubbed off on Mariah.
Okay. But another of the many gems, and remember what Jim just said, that we're talking about music. I come to these people that you write about, and many people in quote popular music, from the opera side, which is where I'm very into musicianship and vocal qualities and elements and so on. And George Michael certainly had that, and Peggy Lee and Lena Horne had that. Your book is full of gems that someone like me thrills to. For example, backstage before a show, George Michael would harmonize with his backup singers to the song "This Little Light of Mine." which is, it says to me so much about George Michael that that would be the song that he would harmonize with. That is a song about freedom, a song about this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. It's from the Black tradition, but it has become a song for everyone that they embrace and love. I love the fact that rather than pray before a performance, he harmonized before, because we see so many people get together in prayer circles on stages that's fine if you want. But I love that George Michael actually thought it was important to harmonize with the singers, and you could hear that.
Peggy Lee did a prayer circle before her performances. She
Yeah.
joined hands and they all said a quiet prayer. And this singer who was absolutely dedicated to the utmost level of preparation, whereby nothing would be left to chance. Every colored gel, every wink, every move of her fingertips was all planned in advance. But the marvel of Peggy is that the reason she did all of that stuff was to give herself the security to be emotionally spontaneous, because she knew where all of the technique was going. And then once that was in place, she could simply glide with it. And I bet there have been opera singers who had the same philosophy.
Well, I can quote James Levine, whose central philosophy was, as a conductor, that you do all the work in rehearsal, so that then when you get out on the stage, you're free because you've done all that work.
Yes.
And, then you follow your instincts on the night, in the moment. And if a singer is a little short of breath, Levine as a conductor would accommodate that. If she is particularly on fire on a night, Levine would make sure that people could hear that. So yeah, it's a similar thing. But I lost my thread that I was going to talk to you about, but it related to the warm up and the preparation. So let me go in a different direction that I asked you at the very beginning of our conversation. I want to get back to it. Once you have chosen your subject, what are your methods for doing the research? Does it start with listening to the performances? Does it start with tracking down people who have known your subject? Obviously, you've done biographies of people who were alive in recent decades, and therefore there were still people around to talk to. Do you ever try, if that person's available, to speak to the subject themselves? What are your methods for writing a musical biography?
Well, let's see. Chet Baker had died in 1988, and I started that book in 1994. Peggy Lee, by the time I began writing my biography of her, Peggy, okay, she was gone. I had done a piece on her for Vanity Fair, but after Peggy had had a crippling stroke, so it was impossible to speak with her for that. Lena was alive, but completely reclusive, although I had had the benefit of the fantastic 2-hour and 15-minute interview that I had done with her for the New York Times, in which she, in my opinion, and this sounds immodest, but I still think that it was the interview of a lifetime. Mm-hmm. I felt that she trusted me and opened up to me in a way that she had seldom done before. And George, of course, was gone. But you start one of these books and you are standing at the foot of a mountain because you have someone's life in your hands. You have to know everything you can possibly know. And so I interview everyone who will talk to me that I can find. In this case, I did fewer than my usual number. I did about close to 250 interviews. I could have easily done another 100, 200, no problem. I get every single piece of written material that I can find, which in this case amounted to over 2,000 articles. I listen to every recording I can get my hands on. I appeal to people who knew that person, asking and worked with them, asking if they have any unreleased material that I can hear. I got quite a bit of that for the George Michael book. In short, I become obsessive about shaking the world and taking everything that falls out of it and putting it into my book. Now the challenge exists. How do you weed through all of that stuff and produce and prune away all of the unnecessary and get down to the heart of it? I don't know. I just do. Nobody by the end of a book can be more exhausted by the subject matter than I am. And that works in my favor because I just start hacking away, snipping things out that don't belong, that don't serve, that don't move the story along or slow it down. I just remembered a little tidbit about that issue from my Lena Horne experience. Did you know Jane White, the
Yes,
wonderful
sure.
actress and singer
Yes.
Jane White?
I knew her because when we did Les Troyens at the Met, she played Hecuba. So
Oh,
I
how
got to know and work with her then. Yeah.
And Jane White was very much around and an approximate contemporary of Lena Horne's, and she had known Lena somewhat, and her father Walter White of the NAACP had been crucial in Lena Horne's early career. And when I had finished the first chapter of my book, which dealt with obviously the childhood and the young adulthood of Lena Horne, and it had a lot of material in it that I thought that Jane White really knew because she was there. She had lived it. She had known some of these people. And it was too long and too larded with unnecessary stuff. And she read it and she said to me, frankly, later on, she said, I was reading this and I thought, oh, get on with it. And that phrase, get on with it, has echoed in my mind hundreds of times since. And when I get too bogged down in details, even interesting details, but stuff that's slowing the story down, I hear Jane White's voice in my head saying, oh, get on with it.
Because my guest back in June, I had the wonderful British bass Matthew Rose, and that's his motto, that when it comes to doing work, just get on with it. Yeah, just get on with it.
Because the people reading a biography, you want a good read, you want a good time, you want to sail along on an adventure that you've never experienced before, and you want to get to know somebody. And writers who get too bogged down in putting everything in but the kitchen sink do it to the detriment of their work.
Well, I want to say that your book about George Michael is wonderfully annotated, so that if anybody wants to know where you heard or saw the following, they can find it because everything is annotated, which I admire you're doing. You referred before to how a singer shapes a song, a cabaret singer, and spoke of the marble that gets removed to leave the sculpture that remains. That comes from Michelangelo.
It does.
If you go to, it does. If you go to Florence and you go to the Accademia Gallery, the famous David is there, but there are also sculptures called the schiavi, the slaves. And what he did was, with all of his sculpting, was decide at which point the sculpture was done. And in the case of the slaves, they still feel that they're stuck in the rock. And when you think about it in the marble, when you think about it, it makes sense because they were enslaved and they were stuck. Unlike the fantastic David, who was 17 feet tall, was made from a flawed piece of marble, and Michelangelo, in his genius, was able to make David stand up and not collapse, even though a crack run through the marble that would have made the sculpture tumble. So it was Michelangelo who first articulated that concept that you brought up here. So Jim, let's talk opera a bit, because I know that you love opera. I've gone to operas with you. I know that you once met Marilyn Horne through me at the opera, and
I did.
And you know, it's my world, in other words, as opposed to your world, which is more cabaret and pop. And I happily travel in your world and you travel in mine. Talk about your love and relationship to opera.
Returning to Fordham University back in the 80s, in the immediate pre-CD era, I became the classical music director for about 2 years at WFUV at a time when WFUV,
the radio station for Fordham. Yeah.
exactly, at a time when WFUV was very much a student-run radio station. And we had a big library of old scratched classical records. And a lot of those opera sets, budget opera sets of Italian radio broadcasts of great operas with Maria Callas and Giuseppe Di Stefano and so forth. And so I took this job very seriously. By the way, nobody else wanted it. I got it by default because all the other DJs there wanted to do rock and roll shifts. And in order to do that, they had to do a classical music shift. So I would create these intricately prepared programs of Lieder by the great Lieder singers, and they would toss all of that aside and put on a Mahler symphony and go out in the hallway and talk. So nevertheless, that period was my education. And we had a gentleman that you probably knew named Anthony Koji, who had a show called Box at the Opera.
I was on his show a lot.
Were you?
Very often. And Regina was his wife or partner or girlfriend. And he was often on at 6 a.m, and I would insist on pre-recording.
But I learned a lot from him. And now we're talking about the mid-'80s. And oh, Lord, what a golden age that was at the Metropolitan Opera, where every cast of every opera, or so it seemed, even the supporting players were eye-popping. And it was overwhelming to me. I began buying standing room tickets for Dress Circle. And I remember standing once for the entirety of Tristan and Isolde. I was the last person. The standing room was full when I arrived. And by the end of the opera, I was the last man standing, literally. But I became enchanted by the majesty of that James Levine era, because in my opinion, James Levine gave me the last golden age of opera of that magnitude. He presided over an era that I will never forget, in which many of my favorite singers blossomed. And he proved himself a singer's best friend in so many ways. And so this expanded my appreciation of the art of singing. I believe, you probably do too, that opera is the highest vocal art because it incorporates so many aspects of performance and vocal artistry. You have to be good at so many things and do them all at the same time and make it seem effortless and make these stories seem like slices of real life that have
in heavy costumes under heavy lights and big scenery.
Oh my God, I sat next to, I don't know Susan Graham, but I sat next to her once at her 50th birthday party that I had been invited to by the conductor Patrick Summers, who's a close friend of hers.
Houston,
and I had a little brief moment to talk with her. And I brought that point up. I said, how do you do all those things at the same time and make it appear so effortless? And in her hand was a plate with a piece of birthday layer cake on it. And she said, it's like this cake. All these different layers and the icing and so forth have been put together into this beautiful creation that becomes seamless. Yeah. Now, that makes it sound quite simple, but Lord knows it's not. And so, for all the different kinds of singing that I revere, I truly bow to the art of the great opera singers who are much more than singers.
Well, I remembered the question that I had blanked on before, namely, in popular music, most singers, most of the time, occasionally with the exception of Barbara Cook, would use microphones. Some for amplification, and I would say others like Ella Fitzgerald, like George Michael, for interpretation. And in opera, we don't use microphones almost always. So one of the key differences is that singers, even in small clubs, would sometimes use a microphone for effect rather than being heard. And when you learn to sing on a mic, you are doing different things. I'm not denigrating that, but it's just a different form than when you sing purely based on vocal technique, as happens in an opera house where often 4,000 people need to hear you over a 75-piece orchestra and other colleagues in the chorus and so on. How, when you evaluate singing, do you factor in the concept of the microphone or not?
The microphone made the art of popular singing possible, because now, prior to that, singers would actually sing through megaphones. And so it was all about volume and projection. But now, and Bing Crosby is the father of that, of great American popular singing, because now with the advent of the microphone, the microphone heard everything. It heard the subtlest movement of breath over the vocal cords, and the microphone could be used like an instrument to maximize the interpretive knack and the intimacy of the art of popular singing. And intimacy is an important word in that, because singers like Doris Day, another one of my great singers, sang as though they were singing into your ear. Peggy Lee did the same thing, and countless other popular singers were able to make you feel that they were singing to you and you alone. And without the microphone, that would not have been possible. And that's why when certain opera singers like David Daniels, whom we discussed earlier, were able to achieve similar effects without microphones, I think that's a marvel.
Yeah, I do too. So, Jim, I know that you have to catch a flight because you're doing lots of promotion, but I'm going to put this out there for the world, and I'll see what you think about it. I should say first that the era you spoke of in the 80s was when I was performance manager of the Met. So if ever you need to ask any questions about any of the performances, I was running them all from the front of house and often backstage, dealing with the needs of the artists, and know them intimately. I think you're ready to write a biography of an opera singer. And I've been thinking during our conversation who that could be. It needs to be a New Yorker for every reason that we established. It needs to be someone who was outstanding in her work. I have a woman in mind. It needs to be someone who, frankly, had a tormented personal life, because it stood in contrast to her achievements on the stage. It needs to be someone who was a master of all media. It needs to be someone about whom there is not a good biography. She wrote a memoir and it was not very good, just not, and it could have been a lot better. It needs to have as an author someone who understands the pomp element. In other words, being someone who crossed over from her opera base to having television shows, to working for mayoral candidates, for running arts commissions, for being a fantastic fundraiser, for having her finger on the pulse of American popular taste. And she happened to live down the street from you. Do you have any idea who I'm talking about?
Beverly Sills is one of my fascinations, Fred. Yes, she lives 1 block away from me in the Beresford at Central Park West and 81st Street. And apart from, or maybe collectively because of all those things you just listed, she was one of the great achieving women of the 20th century. Her story is monumental, evenly divided between her singing career and her arts administration career. And I think it's a story that people need reminding of. And I think that her artistry needs reminding. I mean, she was the opera singer the taxi drivers knew that they thought of as bubbles. She made the high arts accessible to the men on the street. What a huge achievement.
And she could also, with a political endorsement, get a mayor elected, as she partially did with Michael Bloomberg. And I knew her, but I knew her personally not as a singer, but in her career as an arts executive. And she was phenomenally savvy about things like the stock market, about Lincoln Center's investments, about her role on the Met board. When Peter Gelb became general manager of the Met, the very first radio broadcast that was done, Beverly and I were on. She was the host and I was one of the guests. And she was a natural. at these things, but she also was a very serious, purposeful person. Her husband was in media in a very important role, and therefore she understood media better than just about any other classical artist I've ever worked with. And her personal life is both interesting and very tragic. Her relationship to disease was something very particular to her. Her desire to work was incredible. She famously said, not just to me, but she said it to me too, when she retired for a little while from executive work, she said, I just wanted to sit back and smell the roses. And then she said, but I discovered I'm allergic to roses. And she just had to be in the game in one way or another. And that to me is part of the interest, is that she had achieved so much that she really could have kicked back if she wanted to. But instead, she had to stay in almost to her dying day. And she died of a cancer that recurred, and in part, she didn't necessarily take all the care that she should have medically, and that's sad in its way. I don't want to tell her whole story because I would love to read you writing that book. If Abrams wants to do it, I think they should do it right away. If not, then another publisher. You're just exactly the perfect person to do this. That's just my opinion, but we're going to leave it at that because I know you have a flight to get in. Because right now, George Michael is the person you're representing, and you are attracting attention all over the world. It's wonderful, you and your book about George Michael. So, Jim, you and I can talk about music endlessly. I thank you. I thank you for all that you've taught me. That's an Aretha line, by the way, from How I Got Over.
It's true.
But, you know, I love the fact that you and I can exist in New York City and be passionate advocates for the music that we love, and that we don't draw distinctions apart from good music and the other kind. So, Jim Gavin, thank you, my friend.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to speak at this length to the perfect cohort, which is you. I love our conversations. They will continue forever.
Very good. And
Thanks.
I want to read this Beverly Sills book. Have a good flight, Jim. Thank you.
A joy.